From FingerLakes1.com, this is the Weekend Debrief. It's Tuesday, November 10th, and definitely not the weekend, but we are exactly 1 week removed from Election Day. Obviously, this is a special edition of the show. I am joined in studio, though, by Ted Baker from WGVA and WAUB. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. Ted, welcome. We are here. We survived Election Day.
We did, and America won because the process worked. I mean, we thought there would be, and there are still some legal challenges, but I really expected a knockdown, drag out, all the way to the Supreme Court battle, and instead we basically got what we've gotten for 200 years. The people voted, and the decision's been made.
And to that end, obviously, I think we're going to get into talking a little bit more about the legal challenges and things like that that have been percolating or the threat of those that have been percolating since many media outlets declared Joe Biden the president-elect over the weekend. But I'm kind of curious, what were some of your big takeaways from Election Day and or I guess the results as well, but mainly when you look back at Election Day, how people voted, who voted, et cetera, things like that?
To me, the biggest one is still that our system worked. I mean, we're the envy of a lot of countries. We have a very contentious political scene right now, and yet a record number of people came to the polls, expressed their choice, the votes were counted, and we have an apparent president-elect. That's not official, of course, until the Electoral College meets on December 14th. I think the level of participation is great, so I hope we continue to make it easier for people to vote. And then the other thing is we need to fix the mail-in voting so that we don't have ballots coming in after Election Day and red mirages and voting shifts. I think we need to have it so that the votes are all in on Election Day and the count can begin immediately. I don't think it's good to have, in this case, it wasn't as long as we thought. It was 4 days from Tuesday until Saturday morning when most media outlets reported that Biden would be the winner. So I'd like to see that cleaned up so that we have, hopefully in the future, the old-fashioned winner known by late Tuesday, early Wednesday.
Yeah, I made bullet points because I was sort of thinking about what maybe the big takeaways were, notwithstanding the legal challenges and sort of the various sort of issues or roadblocks that might be thrown up between now and when the Electoral College does meet. But turnout definitely exceeded anyone's expectations. I think even some of the most optimistic. I myself was even surprised that given, I guess early voting and mail-in voting is sort of a game changer that no one really could forecast out. But at the same time, I was a little bit surprised that, Donald Trump was able to actually exceed the number of total votes that he had received in 2016. And then, of course, as well, that, Joe Biden was able to clear sort of the low to mid 60 million hurdle and get all the way into the 70 million range, which is pretty, a pretty dramatic shift. Total turnout, in terms of percentage of people who are eligible to vote or should vote, I think we're settling somewhere in like the mid 60s range, which is nice. I guess 2/3 is solid. It's been, if I'm recalling correctly, I think it's been close to 100 years since we've had turnout at that level.
Yeah.
But, when you look back at, the 1800s, actually turnout was always significantly better than that or, much higher than that. So we need a better way of counting votes. That was another one of my big takeaways from Election Day and the days that followed. It needs to be more efficient. Like, there is no reason, even in a state like New York, it doesn't seem like there's any logical reason to not count absentee ballots along with early ballots, along with any other ballots that are received. Just start counting them when they're received. Have a process for, moving them, getting them through. And I almost feel like, and that sort of leads into my third bullet point, which was we might need a federal standard of some kind. And you and I talked about this last week on your show. I'm sure a lot of people listening wouldn't be satisfied with a quote-unquote federal standard. But I'm just going to make the argument that for everybody's sanity, a federal standard would be much better instead of having 50 different ways to do Election Day.
Well, and remember, the state-by-state approach dates back to a time when it took 5 days to get the word that someone was elected across the country, when people were traveling in horses and wagons. So I think, there's really no reason why we shouldn't be able to electronically scan ballots when they come in and have a pretty much instant count on election night. The other thing that, of course, made this election different is that the partisan tilt of the mail-in ballots was heavily Democratic because of attitudes about COVID. We knew going in that Republicans were far more likely to vote in person on election day, and Democrats were far more likely to vote by mail. Assuming we get a vaccine and have no COVID 4 years from now or 2 years from now for the next congressional elections, that probably won't be the case, or at least not to that degree.
Yeah, and I just have to assume, and we're going to get into sort of the party response to the results and things like that, locally and otherwise as we roll through the show here. But, I think sooner than later, most everyone is going to embrace early voting and mail-in voting. And I know this cycle in particular, I think because the incumbent in President Trump his campaign was pushing a narrative that there was going to be fraud no matter what, and mail-in ballot was the wrong way to do this, and the right way was to show up on election day and vote. I think what you'll end up seeing probably is a push away from that, and just in general, more people casting ballots either early or by mail. I know there are a lot of purists out there who say, it's election day, it's not election week or election month, and the ballot should be cast in person with voter ID and all these other strings attached. But at the end of the day, a more modern, less cumbersome system would allow really sensible safeguards to be in place, and also at the same time ensure that the whole process just goes smoother for everybody.
Some states have had exclusively mail-in voting for a number of years. The only thing I don't want to see, I think on early voting, we need to keep it relatively close to whatever we consider election day, because that opens up a whole new can of worms. If people are casting ballots 2 months ahead of time and then candidate dies, major scandal hits after votes are already cast, I don't think that's a good thing. So if there were a way, I think we talked about this, we have the technology. If we put our minds to it, there's really no reason why we couldn't vote on our computer with a mouse click. I mean, and that's one of the other things, I guess, that we didn't get into about this election is it's pretty hard to commit voter fraud, even with the system we have now. You have to know who's registered. You have to fraudulently cast a ballot in that name while hoping that person didn't legitimately cast a ballot. I mean, it's for all the talk of election fraud, even with the system we have now, it would be very difficult to achieve on any significant level.
Yeah, and to that end, obviously, change in this area is not something that's just going to happen overnight. I've seen some people post on Twitter, especially. There's lots of interesting things on Twitter since election day. But one of the narratives that I've seen pretty frequently is this idea that 2016 was the last honest election we had, and that there's just going to be this pervasive voter fraud forever because Republicans lost this time or lost the White House in this case. Obviously, it wasn't the case down ballot. We're definitely going to talk about that more. But distrust of the system, I think, is just for a certain portion of the voting population is going to be pervasive until there is a standard, frankly. I think there needs to be a standard so that everyone can be on board with whatever happens. And if you don't have a standard, and I mean a standard between states and a standard across the board that everyone understands, because another part of this is that a lot of folks clearly don't understand how these various systems work across the country. The fact that there are, Democrats and Republicans involved in the process, the fact that, every state may have its own unique way of doing the process, but at the end of the day, it is a process, and it is a process that's been playing out for decades, uninhibited. So I think a system could help build bolster confidence down the road.
Well, and maybe there's a role for the media to play there. I mean, one of the things that the media did very well in this election was explain a couple of weeks out how things were likely to go. They said, okay, it's possible Donald Trump will have leads in many states on election night because of those in-person ballots that lean Republican. However, when all the votes are counted, including the mail-in ones that lean Democrat, we're going to see some shifts. So maybe we can get the news media to take us inside election counting and show that. Because like you say, I don't think a lot of people know how this is done, that they don't just have the ballots in a back room with one guy counting them, that there are Republican and Democratic commissioners, there are overseers who are allowed to be there, including the campaigns. I mean, that was one of the Trump campaign's complaints, was that they weren't allowed to oversee elections, except in some of the venues where they complained, they actually were, and they said, you want to look, come on in. So maybe there's a role for all of us in the media to explain better how this process works so that people will have more confidence that it's being done legitimately.
Yeah, and I think I don't think this is like when people hear us say like it's the media's job. I think that it's not a job for the CNNs, the Fox Newses, the APs. Like, I don't think it's the national media's responsibility to do that. I think it's local media's job to take care of that, because at the end of the day, you're only going to build confidence in a system if you're showing people the neighbors and the people that they know that are in their world, that they're the ones doing the work.
And see, the other thing too that's different for us here, I mean, where I vote, it's very rural. I go into the Potter Fire Department, and most of the time the person behind the desk knows who I am, and so there's no question about it. Which, by the way, speaking of which, I don't know how it worked where you voted, but I signed my signature onto a touch screen with a popsicle stick. So if there are going to be any signature challenges, it's hard under the best of circumstances to get one on one of those touch screens, but doing it with a disposable popsicle stick is something altogether different. So it's different for those of us that vote in little rural towns in the Finger Lakes and people who stand in line for an hour and a half in a big city where tens of thousands of votes are being counted in a precinct.
Yeah, and I chose to vote by mail this year. It was just the more sensible solution. I work in Seneca Falls. I live in Monroe County. At the end of the day, I think, all of these little sort of nitpicky things are going to have to go by the wayside. I mean, here's a flip side. If we're going to start looking at signatures, and we're really going to start analyzing them, we have to make sure that people are updating their signatures throughout the course of their life, because
right.
The way you sign as an 18-year-old definitely isn't the way you sign probably as a 50-year-old. Also, if we're going to scrutinize, and this affects people, I think, in a more day-to-day way, but if we're going to scrutinize signatures with this kind of intensity when we're voting, whether it be for the dog catcher or president of the United States, we probably also need to examine the way we either do or don't pay attention to signatures in all other portions of life.
Right.
Did you sign when you bought your house and you closed on your house and you're signing 450,000 pages of documents for your mortgage or the car that you bought? Did every single signature line up? And does that somehow invalidate the transaction that took place? No, it didn't. And at the end of the day, I mean, you can make, I suppose, a philosophical argument that, democracy is more important than all of those things. But at the end of the day, if you have that much mistrust of the system, democracy isn't really working in your brain anyway.
Well,
right?
Again, I mean, that technology's there. There's no reason why we can't develop a thumbprint scanner that when we register to vote, we stick our thumb on the scanner, and then every time we go vote, we stick our thumb, and it goes beep, beep, thumbs match.
Yep.
Your vote's good. I mean, it's for whatever reason, and we've talked about it many times here, government technology is way behind private sector technology. We have companies that have already figured out how to do these kinds of things, but we have to have the will and the money to implement them in things like voting.
All right, so we have a ton of reader questions that we received on Facebook, YouTube, Anchor, etc. over the days that followed Election Day. And I'm going to start with John from Palmyra. who said, it looks like we lived through another election cycle where polling data was off or missed significantly. Why does the media continue to rely on it, and why should anyone believe it moving forward? Ted, you can lead us off on this one.
Well, no, the first thing is, I don't think it was as off as widely as a lot of people want to think. This all started in 2016. Nate Silver, 238.com, considered one of the best prognosticators, started out in the sports business doing statistical analysis, went over into politics. He never said Donald Trump is going or Hillary Clinton is going to win. What he said in 2016 was that Hillary Clinton had a 70% chance and Donald Trump had a 30% chance. So if they ran the election 10 times, Trump would win at 3 of the 10. So how do we know that that just wasn't one of the 10? So and his prediction in this election for electoral votes fell right in the middle. He makes a prediction based on confidence level. I'm very confident here, and out on the edges I'm less confident. The final electoral vote total is going to be pretty much right in the middle. So I think that the pollsters did a better job overall than they're given credit for. Having said that, they did miss significantly in some places. The 24th district had Katko-Balter a dead heat. It was nothing but. It was 58 to 41 or something like that in favor of Congressman Katko. I think what happened in this election, the general feeling going in was that Democrats would be very motivated to go to the polls to throw out Donald Trump. I think what happened was Republicans were equally motivated to go to the polls to keep him in. And that's why we had the record turnout. And I don't think anybody's model ever predicted a record turnout. So I think Republicans did a very good job of getting their voters out. And that's what elections are going to be going forward. We're a divided country, and even this election, turn around a few thousand votes in a few states, and you have a different winner. So I think that the pollsters are going to have to refine what they do, but I still think that they do it pretty well. As to the media relying on polls, I would much rather see us focus on candidates and their beliefs. I think horse race journalism is lazy, and I think that's why a lot of media do it, frankly, is because they're lazy. It's a lot easier to get the numbers than it is to dig into Dana Balter's health care plan and John Katko's health care plan and Biden's position on this issue and Trump's position on that issue.
Yeah, and I pretty much agree with every point you made there. I mean, as far as an answer goes, I really don't think the media should rely on polling data. I think that, if, like everything else, like media consumption in general, if you want to find a poll that fits the outcome that you want to see or you believe is starting to shape up, then you're going to find it, and it's out there. The only poll I really ever paid attention to throughout the cycle is the Real Clear Politics sort of average. They do an aggregate.
Right, and they know which polls lean which way, and so they adjust accordingly. So,
you have that, and we do get questions. Every year we always get questions, especially during congressional race season, why we don't run stories on, say, like you said, the congressional polling in the 24th district. And, this outcome, I think, is pretty significant for that. And I know there's a lot of reason to believe that, the last two cycles have been a little bit anomalous in terms of why people are voting. In 2016, it was the shock of an unusual candidate in Donald Trump, and now very clearly a base that was energized by Donald Trump turning out to vote again. At the end of the day, I think it acts as filler, and I'm not crazy about that, and that's one of the reasons why I kind of would like to see media in general steer away from it, in the same way that, look, I don't think polls are any more effective in telling us what is going on in a race than debates are a good evaluation of where the candidates stand on issues, or campaign ads are a good reflection of what candidate A thinks about candidate B, or vice versa.
Well, and frankly, people like the horse race. I mean, Tell me that you didn't do, we're media geeks anyway, so I guess we're different, but all over America, what did people do Wednesday and Thursday and Friday? They hit refresh on that map 1,000 times, hoping to find out how Arizona went, how Pennsylvania went. So I think partly, I'm making an excuse for us, I guess, but media we give the public what they want. If they want horse races, they're going to get horse races.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, again, different organizations do different things, and local media does not cover political races the same way that national media does. Newspapers cover them completely different than radio does. Digital does it differently. So you have all these different factors, but I think generally at the end of the day, should people take them a little less seriously, the polling? Yes, because at the end of the day, my issue with them has always been, you look at the margin of error for any given poll, and typically the candidates fall within the margin of error. Now
also remember too that the polling is far more sophisticated when you get to the presidential level than it's going to be at the congressional level, and that's why we don't ever see any polls. Nobody bothers taking polls for races for assembly or state senate. Maybe downstate they do, but we never have those numbers here because it isn't worth anyone's while to try to survey those races.
Chris from Gorham asks, should the news media have called the race for Biden sooner or not at all? It seems there are two different camps on this one. Yes, there are two different camps on this one. And I'm going to say something that I think maybe might surprise you a little bit, Ted. No is my answer to that one. I don't think the media should call races in general. Media is still trying to conform to some old norms when we're living in a very different world now, right? Like, digital media has changed the way people consume news and information. So I think that you need to be more selective about what information you're putting out there, because oftentimes the headline will be taken out of context or without proper contextualization. Just like endorsements, I think newspapers should steer away from, day before election day endorsements. But a lot of organizations still do it. At the end of the day, for me, media in general has a lot of outdated processes to deal with. And because of what we've seen this cycle so far, my assumption is that moving forward, we probably won't see too many races that are clean, wash your hands, no contest, no lawsuits, no anything. So my assumption, especially since I'm not that confident that what we talked about earlier is actually going to happen, where we will have better processes for voting or for counting ballots, I think finding out sometime in December who the president is going to be, probably going to be the norm moving forward.
I don't think that people want to know, and I don't think you can tell the media, hey, don't tell us. Someone's going to do it. So, I think that and to differentiate between the polling and the calling of races, over the years, the calling of races has been pretty accurate. Fox News, which is criticized for its right-wing lean, has one of the best decision desks that there is. And so they called Arizona early for Joe Biden. I think people want to know who the winner is. And I don't think it's irresponsible. They all wait until the polls have closed in a given state so that they're not affecting the voters. So I don't see any big problem with that, because I think that people want to know who's ahead, and I don't see any evidence that any media are putting their thumbs on the scales. They're simply reporting what they know, and they're very good at determining, okay, 80% of the vote are in this state, which 80%, from which areas. Okay, the vote that's out is from a heavily Democratic area, therefore the Democrat's going to gain. The flip side of that argument has been, and this argument's been made by people on the right, that the media declared Joe Biden president-elect. And to that, I would say what the media did was report the vote totals as announced by the states. Okay, CNN didn't make this up. The state of Pennsylvania said Joe Biden is the winner. The state of Michigan said Joe Biden is the winner. The state of Florida said Donald Trump is the winner. And the media reported that. So there may be ways of doing it better, but I don't think there's any effective way you can tell the media, hey, don't call it, wait a couple days.
Yeah, and the next question that we had received is actually in the same vein, sort of the curiosity that people have about journalists and news organizations in general, which is that Megan from the town of Ontario asked us, should journalists be registered to a party or even vote, given how their credibility is often questioned by audience, whether deserving or not?
Here's a secret about media people. We care about the result a lot less than people think we do. I mean, it isn't going to color my reporting. And again, we have different roles. I'm a host of a program. I give opinions in that role, but I also interview newsmakers, and I treat those differently. My politics lean leftward. I pride myself, if you didn't know who I was and you heard me interview Tom Reed, you wouldn't know what my politics were. I think the answer is most of us take more pride than that, and I don't think that we're badly serving democracy. Everyone has opinions. Every single person who writes a headline or puts a story up on a website or writes an article in the newspaper has their opinions. I don't think, for the vast majority of us, those opinions stop us from being fair and down the middle in our coverage.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it should matter, but at the same time, I understand that for a lot of people it does. Just the outward appearance that someone that they're reading a story from, and this goes back to the mass distrust. There's just general blanket distrust, absent evidence, absent fact, absent any number of other things that would lead someone to that point.
Well, and maybe, maybe we need more transparency and disclaimers and things. I mean, if I'm here on this program and we start talking about Hobart and William Smith, I'll bring up the fact that I'm employed part-time doing games at Hobart and William Smith, and therefore that might color whatever if there's something like I feel is going to color my opinion, I will make that clear up front every time. And maybe we should have more of that, where somebody says at the end of the article, hey, I'm a registered Democrat, or I don't know.
So I don't know Megan, and I don't know what she was pointing to when she was asking this question. But my assumption is that she's looking at national media. She's looking at people
Probably
on CNN.
So.
She's looking at people on MSNBC, Fox, etc. Me personally, so here's my thing. Over the summer, I changed my party affiliation. I had been registered a Republican, good, bad, indifferent, since I turned 18 years old, and I basically went to a no mark. So I am truly independent.
And so am I. I've been that way all along. Yeah. I generally tend to vote for Democrats, but not always.
To your point about those of us in the media not caring as much about the outcome, especially when we're talking about local elections and things like that, I think for me that rings really true, because that is one of the, I do more on the day-to-day. I do more sort of reporting. I still cover the Seneca County Board of Supervisors, and I'll fill in here and there where reporters can't. But for me personally, I have to do my job whether a Democrat's elected or a Republican is elected.
Well, and in at both the local of our cases, the primary area that we cover is not the area where we live.
Right.
So, if I'm talking about a Geneva City Council race, I really don't have a whole lot of skin in that game.
And let's take it a step further. Neither one of us, or most journalists for that matter, see a big difference in terms of access or in terms of what they're able to achieve through their work if a Democrat or a Republican is elected versus the other. So for me, this is one of those scenarios where I think if the journalist or the news organization has a bit of baggage attached to it, I think for those individuals it's probably a better idea to be as neutral as humanly possible, forward-facing and otherwise, unless you're leaning into it. And if you're leaning into it, then that's a totally different scenario.
And from a media standpoint, one of the most, you're talking about the takeaways from this election, one of the most fascinating things right now is the conservative pushback against Fox News for playing it straight and down the middle. Fox News was what they advertised themselves as, which is fair and balanced in their election coverage, and that made a lot of people on the right very mad. They wanted Fox to come on and say, fraud, Biden steals election, and they didn't do it. And you're going to see, I think, a tremendous erosion in the ratings of Fox News because they weren't partisan enough in the eyes of a lot of their viewers.
Okay, so here's a topic that we had we glanced over this one on your show last week. But Shauna from Farmington wrote us to ask, I'm registered Democrat, but voted for a mixed ballot this year. I'm concerned about the margin we saw in some assembly, Senate, and congressional races in rural parts of upstate. Our party appears to be disadvantaged. Is this just my perception or a reality party chairs need to deal with in upstate rural New York? There's the question. What do you think?
The Democratic Party is extremely disadvantaged in upstate New York. They're outnumbered, and your only way to fix that is to adapt your policies to better suit what the voters want. And that's always hard to do because becoming more like the Republicans probably isn't going to win away Republican votes. The other alternative is to go in the other direction. I mean, and that's, that argument's going on nationally within the Democratic Party right now because a lot of the people on the progressive side are saying, hey, we're the ones that helped get Joe Biden elected. And now on the more corporate centrist side, those people are being pushed to the margins and they're not going to be offered the kind of cabinet positions that kind of centrists are. So, I mean, politics, someone said, is the art of persuasion. So if Democrats are going to make inroads in upstate New York, they've got to persuade a lot more voters that they offer something that they want. And for whatever reasons, they have not been able to do that over the years.
All politics is local, right? We're always saying that. It's something that we keep hearing over and over again. And I think at the end of the day, any party would be better served. Looking at local issues and creating as hyper local a party as humanly possible.
Well,
whatever that means.
Look at the two main congressional races in our area: the 24th, Cadco and Balter; the 23rd, Reed and Metrano. Almost all of the advertising was an attempt to hook onto the coattails of the presidential nominee.
Right.
So Tom Reed is part of Team Trump and Metrano is part of Team Biden. So maybe there's something to that. Maybe the candidates ought to spend more time talking about what they'll do for the local voters rather than saying, if you vote for this person, Antifa's coming to your house, and if you vote for this person, Donald Trump's going to take away your medical care or whatever. I mean, it was a lot of the advertising in those two races was the complete antithesis of what you're talking about. It was nothing at all about local, and it was all about, up ballot the presidential nominees.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's like a what have you done for me kind of thing. And I think at the end of the day, if you look at sort of before the parties start to do their gymnastics when election season comes around, when you look at sort of the natural resting place of both the local Democratic parties and the local Republican parties, Republicans are better suited to talk about issues that are relevant to hyperlocal politics. What do I mean? Like property taxes, zoning, codes, the things that get your town board fired up, that get your board of supervisors, your legislatures fired up. And Democrats oftentimes, especially in places where they don't have a real strong hold on any elected offices, really tend to lean into the easy stuff or the stuff that feels like the easy stuff, pointing to the big national politics. This is just me, and I've covered the 23rd race thoroughly now for 3 cycles, and it makes me laugh when you listen to candidates talk about cybersecurity and you talk about national security and international issues, and I don't care that that's what you're going to have to deal with when you go to Congress. Voters don't care about that here. They don't care about that. Like, if you live in Rushville, odds are you probably care about Rushville. You probably care about the fact that you sit in between, very precariously in between 2 counties, and the policies that those counties make have a far greater impact on your day-to-day life than any of the policies passed down by Congress. So the answer, in my mind, is that Democrats, yes, they do have a problem, and the answer has got to be that they have to get hyper local on issues. They
the
just
other
do.
problem the Democratic Party has locally and nationally is, I think, a big messaging deficit. The right is much better able to get its message out. I mean, if a right-wing talking, let's look at the accusations of voter fraud. Turn on your talk radio in the morning on our station, and at 9 o'clock, Brian Kilmeade will tell you there's voter fraud. Flip over to another station at 12 noon, Rush is going to tell you there's voter fraud. At 3 o'clock, Hannity's going to tell you there's voter fraud. At 6 o'clock, Levin's going to tell you. Who's going to tell you there's not? The Democrats have never been able to build up a messaging infrastructure, and they've allowed Republicans to paint them in a certain way as radical, way far out there. How many times do you hear the term radical or far left agenda for proposals that really aren't that far out there? I mean, this is going to be a little partisan and a little simplistic, but we have a political party right now, one of whose major messages is that you being able to afford to go to the doctor is a bad thing, and we need to do away with it. Again, being very simplistic, but how is that message able to penetrate? Obamacare is bad, this is awful, this is awful. Why is the opposite message that a lot of people can't afford to go to the doctor, that message isn't penetrating?
Well, I mean, I feel like the answer to your question, taking it the way you did, to me it feels like you have two different groups of people and two different parties playing by entirely different rules and even playing two different games. And I'll use local media as an example, but if you I listen to a lot of local radio, regional radio, that kind of thing. Use Rochester as an example. You've got Evan Dawson on one hand, who is viewed as the left-leaning talk radio host, and then you've got Bob Lonsberry, who is the right-leaning conservative radio host, or right-wing, depending on.
Let me just interrupt
day.
real quickly, because you don't have that in most of the country. Rochester's a decent-sized city, so you have a public radio station that can have an Evan Dawson. Out across the Corn Belt, in Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas, you're not going to find an Evan Dawson on the radio.
But here's so think anything you hear on NPR, more or less, it's painted as if it's this left-leaning media outlet. But what are they doing? Well, Evan Dawson hosts an hour-long, two-hour block, 2-hour-long discussions on an issue where he rarely actually puts his own politics out there. And you compare that to Lonsberry's program, which is 3 or 4, 15 to 20-minute interviews, but the rest of it is just, you basically have got 3 hours of him just giving opinion and just giving his take on things. And they're compared as if they're like equal counterparts in the whole ecosystem of, talk and discussion and Discord and all that kind of thing. But they're not at all. They're not equal. Like, the way someone reacts to someone who agrees, someone who is inclined to agree with one or the other, the way those individuals react to both of those programs is vastly different.
Well, and because I don't think this is overgeneralizing, conservative hosts are very activist. Liberal progressive hosts tend not to be. They see themselves more as fair presenters of the facts. Rush Limbaugh isn't a fair presenter of the fact. He wants Donald Trump to win. He wants there to be election fraud. He wants you to think so, and he wants you to holler about it. And that's what they do, proudly and unapologetically. The other thing that I find is that, in general, the Republicans are better at closing ranks. There's always this split within the Democratic Party between the more leftist people, like the AOCs or the Bernie Sanders, or to a degree the Elizabeth Warrens, and then the more centrist kind of corporate wing that controls the money and that tends to get nominated. It's no coincidence that Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee, not Bernie Sanders, not Elizabeth Warren. I mean, when you think about it, almost everybody who ran for the Democratic nomination was to the left of the guy who got it.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit here. We spent a little more time on those questions than I anticipated. We have microcluster restrictions in Monroe and Onondaga counties. Both of those obviously outside of our core audience here, but we've got people who are listening there. And we've also got folks in Ontario County and Cayuga County and Wayne County who are hearing that announcement and getting a little bit worried about what could be coming. We've talked about the state's approach, and you and I think, came to a little bit of an agreement a few weeks ago that widespread shutdown probably isn't happening again. But could most of the state get painted yellow? I'm thinking maybe it could. That said, it seems like most of this energy is being focused on more densely populated counties as opposed to the quote-unquote rural ones. Obviously, a lot of folks are going to say, well, wait a second, Steuben County painted yellow right now according to the governor. Rural county, kind of, but it has more urban pockets. You've got Corning, and in the southern tier, I mean, it's kind of, southern tier, western New York, that part of the long Pennsylvania corridor kind of is the most populated portion of that region. So, what do you make, I guess, is the big question. Obviously, we're a day removed from the announcement itself, which came yesterday. What do you make of the changes that we've seen happen now?
Well, for one thing, I'm surprised we're not yellow yet, at least in Ontario County, and I think we will be. I've been critical of a lot of the governor's response since day one, so I do have to say I think the response of moving away from one size fits all and really trying to target where the outbreaks are to the smallest possible area is a good approach. And I agree, you came up with a theory a few weeks ago that it was a recognition that our economy can't take widespread shutdowns. So I think it's a better approach than we've had. We also now have the news that a Pfizer vaccine could be on the market maybe January, February, and begin to roll out. So I think maybe we're in hang-on phase. Maybe if we just can hang in there and keep the masks and keep the distancing for 3-4 more months, that we might be at least able to see the beginning of the end.
Yeah, I think the microcluster strategy works on paper, but it probably doesn't work to the effect that the state wants it to. Why? Because the cases, and I kept hearing it this morning on the radio, folks on in certain pockets saying, this is happening because young people are going to bars and they're doing this and they're the other thing, and we're seeing so many more cases in the 20 to 30 or the young. If you listen to the messages that are coming out from local health departments every day, it's clear that that's not the case. That is not what's happening factually. Fact check. Small gatherings of fewer than basically 12 people at people's homes are what's driving the increase in community spread. Mendoza said it in Monroe County the day before they got the hammer dropped on them for being painted yellow. We've heard that message come out of Ontario County. We've heard it come out of Cayuga County. I'm pretty sure I've seen it at least once come out of Wayne County, even though they've had more of a nursing home problem as of the last month or so. Look, at the end of the day, you can't microcluster your way out of that. There is nothing you can do to prevent people from going. And I don't think this is going to be something that gets better over the next 2 to 3 to 4 weeks. I think that, frankly...
Well, I understand what you're saying, but when you look at the first areas where this approach was used, it seems to have worked pretty well. We had, in some of the boroughs in New York City, we were getting double-digit positive rates, and now, though most of those boroughs are below what we're seeing in the Finger Lakes.
But they had escalated.
Maybe it was just luck. I don't know.
They had escalated beyond yellow. They had escalated into territory, so like orange and red, where like businesses get shut down.
The targeting approach, whatever they did in those areas, got the infection rate down from 12 and 15% to 2 and 3% in a fairly short period of time, maybe a month or so.
So does that work in New York City because of how long it takes to commute to neighboring places where you could potentially do things, and people have less transportation traditional transportation? And can that be effective in a place like, for example, this is what my fiance and I were talking about over the weekend, Monroe County. If you live in the Finger Lakes, you probably go to Monroe County to go to a mall or to do some sort of recreational whatever. Monroe County is yellow. Say it goes orange in a couple weeks and non-essential businesses are forced to close. You would have a scenario where Grease Ridge Mall and Marketplace Mall, which what I live near, would be forced to close, but Eastview Mall, which is by far the busiest of any of the three malls in Monroe County or around Monroe County, would be allowed to stay open. So are you going to have to and here's the thing, it is so much easier for us up here, if you live in Seneca County, to drive to Ontario County to do something that you can't do in Seneca County. If you live in Ontario County, drive to Wayne County or drive to Seneca County. Or if you live in I don't know that there is a fix to the thing we're seeing happen right now. Short of preventing people from gathering at their home, which is never going to be possible, I don't know how you get out of this.
Well,
honestly.
I think one way, for whatever reason, I've seen this, and maybe you've seen it, there seems to be an attitude in a lot of people that when they hang out with people they know, that somehow is a lower risk than being around people they don't know. So I think that's why you're getting these 3 families gather for a backyard barbecue and then spread it all over the place. So I think if there's a way out of it, it's just more, especially now that you've got the carrot out here of the vaccine, you say to people, look, you hate this, I hate this, we all hate this, we gotta do it for a few more months. You gotta wear the masks, you gotta be careful, you can't have 15 people over to your house for Thanksgiving dinner this year, but if you do these things, maybe next year you can. So I think maybe that's what changes it, is using that vaccine as sort of the carrot out there in the not too distant future, where you say, okay, because I think part of what's happened, frankly, is I just think it's been fatigue. I think a lot of people who were practicing safety measures kind of let down their guard, especially when we went through week after week after week of 0.3% and people like me saying on the radio that there's hardly any COVID around in the Finger Lakes. I mean, maybe that's contributed to it. So your overall point, interstate, you can't build a fence around a virus. Anytime you have a color zone, it has to end somewhere, and it's silly that this restaurant is yellow and this one a half a mile away isn't because it's across the line.
Right.
I don't know how you fix that. You really can't. If you're going to draw lines, you got to draw them somewhere, and I think that's preferable to wide swaths of the state having to face more shutdowns.
Well, and I think there should be the admission at this point that I listened to plenty of well-intentioned people throughout the spring and into the summer, especially when things started to reopen, particularly folks on the political left who were talking about their quarantine bubbles and their circles and their groups and all this other stuff, and it created doubt, and it created a scenario where people could look at that decision or that individual's decision and say, well, wait a second, you're saying that we shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z things, but you're meeting with these people you don't know. And now, yes, you combine that with this fatigue that we're seeing now with the virus itself, and all of a sudden people just, they're doing things maybe that they wouldn't have been comfortable doing in March or April.
And I think also there might have been better buy-in if the initial measures had been more consistent and made more sense. We said this back in March and April. It breeds disrespect when you have one rule that applies to a bowling alley and a different one. Again, if I can sit in my backyard with 15 people and have a barbecue, why can't I go to a movie theater? I mean, you can now, but
yeah.
for the longest time you couldn't. So I think if the measures had made more sense and been more consistent early on, people might have been more willing to follow them and be more willing to continue to follow them now.
Yeah, and as we start to run out of time here, I'll link to the last 2 stories we're going to talk about, but I'm just not going to talk as much about them before we jump into the discussion aspect of it. First is the state has been absolutely hammered by layoffs, and it wasn't the Democrat and Chronicle. I want to say it was Gannett, their state team, looked at basically all of the warn notices that had been filed in the first 10 months of 2020, and they compared that to past years. And what they found was that the first 10 months of warn notices filed in New York State have exceeded the total number in the last 6 years. Some of the big numbers that came out of that, one of the numbers that stuck out really significantly to me, statewide, high-wage jobs, those that earn $60,000 and over, are down by 4% since the pandemic began, while low-wage jobs, those who gross less than $27,000 a year, have declined by 21%. The question is, what does the disparity tell us about this rosy view of how things are improving and how the economy is getting so much better in New York State, and the methodical approach that New York State employed is working? And I guess it's crazy to talk about this right off of the conversation we just had, but we are. What does it tell us, and what do we make of what we're hearing versus what we're seeing in this this is a pretty stark contrast in my view.
I think, and I've thought this all along, I think it's worse than we think. I think it's a lot worse than we think. But there's a self-fulfilling prophecy factor when it comes to economy. If the chambers of commerce and the business people say that it's bad, then you start thinking at home, wow, it's bad, I better sit on my money, I better not spend, and then it just creates a vicious circle. So I think it's going to be a huge factor. Let's say we get a vaccine. Pfizer rolls out their vaccine in February 1st, and by next July 4th, almost everybody's had it, and COVID is down to practically nothing, and hallelujah, we're back to normal again. It's going to be years. And I don't know that we get back to normal again. It'll be a fascinating, count the number of wineries around the Finger Lakes and see how many of them are still running in 2027. And small restaurants. I mean, everybody's putting up a brave face and trying to convince us that we're all going to eat outside in little plastic bubbles in December when it's 4 degrees. Good luck with that. I hope, I'm not wishing for that, but I think it's worse than people think. We have a poll on our website where I asked basically your approach to COVID. Number 1 was, I don't give it much regard. Number 2 is kind of the middle approach. Number 3 is, I fear COVID and I stay in my house only when necessary to go out. 32%. In November 2020, 32% of the people said, I fear COVID and I don't leave my house unless I really need to. 1 out of every 3 people is hunkered down in their house and afraid to go to Wegmans and afraid to go to the restaurant and afraid to send their kids to school.
Yeah, and I don't see that changing anytime. That's not going to change anytime soon. And to your point, it may very well not change before it actually does change at all. Earl Martin, back in the spotlight here in Seneca County. He's seeking a new pilot from the IDA to expand Deer Haven Park. Obviously, created a whole lot of discussion. There's an effort within the Board of Supervisors at this point to try and get the state to stop the sale of the former Hillside campus from the IDA to Martin. Whole lot of debate and discussion about the specifics of this situation, which I don't want to touch as much as the broad idea here that there is a pilot being considered potentially that would add no jobs and would at the same time create a significant tax break for the individual. This is just, to me, when people talk about pilots and you listen to some of the folks who have been for years in local politics rant and raving about the way in which we do economic development. This is just among the most prime examples I've seen ever. This is just something that isn't sustainable in my view. Like, the state is going to have to acknowledge that something is very wrong with the way we do economic development or with the business climate in this state if these kinds of benefits need to be extended in order to get a business owner or an entrepreneur or developer to just do something that will create no jobs. No jobs.
I think looking
Wild.
at the broad picture, I think Seneca County has taken the path of least resistance. They had all this land at the depot. They had nobody wanted it. Along comes someone who says, I'll take it. And they just said, thank God, here, we'll sell it to you. You need a tax break? Sure, we'll give you one. You need another one? Sure, we'll give it to you. Out of fear that if we don't, he'll walk away, and now we got a big empty plot of land again. So, we talked about it with the sale of Hillside, that it doesn't sound like there was any real diligent effort to market that property. It was simply, oh, thank God somebody wants it, let's give it to them. So, yeah, I think there's a better way. And to use a sports analogy, they're behaving the way that football coaches behave when they're 4th and 1 at their own 40 and they punt. The numbers show us that punting isn't the best choice there, but if you punt, you'll never be criticized. If you go for it and you don't get it and the other team comes down and scores, you'll be criticized. So if they let the one guy that they've got off the hook, they're going to be criticized. Well, you guys, you had a buyer and you didn't sell them the depot. So I think they're kind of in a no man's land. But then the bigger picture, I've said a number of times, I think our economic development efforts are misplaced. I think the best way you could do economic development was the way we had back a few months ago when everybody in America got a check or a debit card. I think that's how you do economic development, is put money into the pockets of consumers and let them decide what they want to do with it. Because inevitably, these promises of jobs almost never materialize. If you go back and look at any of these big, the Optronics there and whatever it was in Canandaigua, how many hundreds of jobs did they promise back 10 years ago? How many of those ever developed?
Yeah, it's not, and I don't necessarily criticize the people who sit on these boards, who make the decisions, because I think in a lot of cases they feel like they're making the best decision possible for their community. I think this is a systemic issue, and at the end of the day, there needs to be a better way of going about it. I would like to see more targeted investment in certain industries, in certain areas, where there is a broad consensus that money should be spent. It shouldn't be as random as it ends up being in the grand scheme of things, right? Like, how many of these, I hate to say this, but this will be a little critical of folks who run IDAs. How often are the people who run IDAs actually going out and actually going across state borders and going to other places to try and solicit business to come to their community? How often does that happen?
I don't know. It's interesting. There are some, a number of the network programs that we carry on a radio station have ads for Michigan that right. say we're this and we're that and we're high tech and come to Michigan. So some of this does happen. The problem they run into is, if you don't give Earl Martin the tax break or somebody like him, there's another county, another state nearby that will. And that's that, how do you stop that race to the bottom? So we can say, well, that's it. We're not giving any more pilots to these people because they're not creating the jobs. So, okay, he says fine, and he takes his business 3 counties over or 3 states over.
Yeah, there isn't really a clean answer here, and this is obviously something that we'll be talking more about down the road. My point, I think, is mainly just in that if you look at what the core responsibility of what IDAs are supposed to do, I don't think a vast majority of them do them, and I'm not talking about jobs or anything else. I'm talking about like actually going out and getting business. And I don't mean broad marketing efforts that a state has, because I'm sure if you live in another state, you hear all the time about how great New York State is. I'm sure New York is spending that money somewhere. We just don't hear it because we're already right here. I'm talking about sort of like this, the grassroots. If you are, an example, the executive director of the Schuyler County IDA, and I have no idea what their economic development arm actually is, but if that's what you are, how often do you go to other places around the state, whether those be the major metros or places outside of the state, to meet with people, meet with entrepreneurs, meet with business developer, meet with property developer, whatever the case may be, to actually try and solicit something to come to your community. How much of that is instead site selectors sending you an email and you getting the email after they've reached out to you 205 times because you got spam filtered, and finally they say, oh yeah, this person wants to develop here. And before the process even begins, there's already this like assumption, because the person, the entity, the IDA is playing catch up, that, well, we're going to have to give them something to get them to want to come here. And it's just the wrong way. It's the wrong way to do it, in my view. The state could do better. The counties could do better. And, this whole trading this for a few dozen jobs, or this many hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars for a few dozen jobs, it doesn't balance out, no matter how many jobs is actually created. Good example, Del Lago, at the end of the day, right now, still operating at 25% capacity. I think the last I'd heard from some folks who work out there or did previously work out there, they brought back like a third or less of their staff. You're still talking about, hundreds of, in the upper hundreds of employees still without work who worked there, and that doesn't change. It doesn't change overnight.
And, I've said many times, because I criticize the overall efforts, but I hate to criticize the people doing it, because I think their hands are a little bit tied. One of the ways that we rate these people is on the big headline. As I've said, it's 200 new jobs is a big headline. 100 small businesses add 2 jobs each isn't. And that's, what ultimately creates economic development is consumer demand. If you create the conditions, that's why the whole approach of let's try to get this kind of business in, that kind of business, the approach ought to be give people money, see what they want, and then if they want something, people will build it. There was a demand for wine, and a wine industry sprung up. There was a demand for beer and cider industry sprung up.
Yeah. Well, that's that. That's this week. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News in Geneva. That's 95.9, which is soon moving up the dial to 106.3.
How soon?
December. Around the 1st of December.
Okay.
We'll let everybody know exactly. For now, it's still 95.9, always 1240, the old school. And in Auburn, it's 98.1 FM and 1590 AM WAUB.
All right, that's that. The Weekend Debrief is a production of FL1 Digital Media. Check the show out on Spotify or wherever you get podcasts. Have a question for us? Email it to debrief@fingerlakes1.com. You can also check out our daily debrief, which is a shortened version of this podcast, where we dive into local issues and headlines with the people behind them. Check that out by visiting fingerlakes1.com/daily. You can also find those episodes in this very feed on Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you are listening from. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.